evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's webinar, where we're joined by James Heaton-Smith, who's going to talk through his experiences transferring from the military and his journey to where he's ended up now at Uber. Just to briefly introduce myself, I was an Army officer after I left university. I then moved into banking, and I'm now a career consultant here at the Officers Association. So without further ado, I'll let James introduce himself, but just to say thank you very much, James, for joining us tonight. It's a real pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Lisa, that's great. Firstly, many thanks for everyone that's joined, and hopefully this is going to be really useful. I'm going to rattle through fairly quickly because I want to allow a good amount of time for questions. So this is me, I'm not going to dwell on it, 25 years in the Royal Logistic Corps, fulfilling a range of roles across defence, and I left in December 2015. I then went on the JP Morgan internship, and after a fairly brief stint there, managed to get a job at the Bank of England as a programme manager. And a fairly large portfolio of projects ranging from regulatory change, risks and controls, through to behavioural change and general sort of change management. From there, I then moved to Uber, where I'm currently head of compliance. So it's probably worth noting that I probably wouldn't have got the job at the Bank of England unless I'd gone to JP Morgan, and probably wouldn't have arrived at Uber unless I'd gone to the bank, because it was just a whole raft of transferable skills that I attained along the way. And of course, it also helped that my last job in the Army was as head of sort of global compliance for logistic and technical functions. Great. So I want to talk a bit about what sort of roles you could transfer into. And I think the first thing is people ask, what do you want to do when you leave the Army? The problem is that most people don't necessarily know what they want to do. And they don't know what they want to do because they don't know what's out there. And I love coming across these jobs that I never knew existed. And I suspect there's probably a job out there with your name on it that you've probably never even heard of. And what it does take is a lot of research and legwork. So a friend of my wife's, she used to work for Bright Bricks, which is one of the biggest Lego commissioning companies. She now has left there and is actually an independent Lego consultant. So basically she goes around the world, builds things out of Lego. It's amazing. Another guy I know, a friend of his is a thread wizard, and he goes around the whole of the south of England and helps garages when they can't get a bolt out. And again, the sort of Bank of England, I never even knew the Bank of England employed people. I thought it was all sort of fiscal conehead types. And I had no idea that actually had a change function that spent about 70 million a year and had 53 full-time project managers. So I think the thing to do is just keep doing your research. And I think part of it is understanding what you are and what could you be. And you need to have a really good understanding of these sort of terms in the civilian context. So what does a logistician mean, to the civilian world? What's a trainer? What does it mean to be working in operations, which is completely different to how we see operations in the military? The difference between project management and project management office, and things like strategy and change. What does that mean? What do BAs do? How do I get a business development role? What do general managers do, etc. And again, it's really about understanding these roles in civilian context. And again, it's about speaking, building a network, and just chatting to people to get an understanding of this. I've got a twin brother. He's worked in oil and gas for sort of 25 years, and I picked his brains over all of these things to really get an understanding of the civilian world, of which I think I was particularly naive. I think the next thing is, do you want to transition into a company or a role? And I think that's something you need to think about. So for example, do you want to go and work for a big corporate? Do you want to go into work for HSBC? Or are you sort of more functionally minded? I want to go and work in HR. I want to go and work in recruiting. Clearly, with those sorts of roles, you could work in virtually any industry, but a lot of it will depend on your long-term goal. But one thing I knew I didn't want to be is probably an army consultant, so consultants in army headquarters. And therefore, for me, my initial sort of plan for leaving the army was to get as far away from the army as possible and do something quite different, then hopefully acquire some additional skills and see where that leads. I think it's also really important to understand what might open doors for the future. And clearly that depends a lot in terms of your own aspirations, but are you looking at sort of a particular company? Do you need any specific qualifications? Do you need to network with a particular group of people to get where you think you might like to be? And I think the thing to do is try and go for roles and companies where actually your opportunities and transferable skills are sort of increased rather than going into a role that actually probably sort of locks you down or puts you in a particular pigeonhole. And I think the other thing is to understand stepping stones. We're not just going to leap into a sort of, something quite different straight away. Someone I knew at the bank, they started out as a PMO in the sort of rail industry. Then they went to Royal Mail as a project manager. So again, they've moved up from the PMO side. And then they arrived in finance at the bank. And actually, they did a job in one of the business lines, and the business really liked them. So actually, after they'd been a project manager there for about a year and a half, they then actually transferred to work on that business line. So again, just a really good example of how someone has used some stepping stones to get to where they'd like to be. And I think finally, it's a good old adage, but time spent at recce, definitely not wasted. And you really need to be doing almost daily research. It is a grind, but I think if you want to get out there and get a job, then that's really what you need to do. So that means you need to be out there looking for roles, looking at your skills, networking, and really gaining a good understanding of how organisations and companies work and the sort of organisations you might want to actually work for. So, I mean, I think all of those five are really key, and I'm going to cover some additional ones as well. And I think in particularly creativity is probably actually becoming more important across the board, not just in sort of tech companies and that sort of thing, but I think people are always looking to how you can create value, how you can be more creative, how you can do different things differently. So it's definitely a key transferable skill. What I've done is looked at some sort of typical military skills and attributes, and my sort of top three that I think are less relevant are loyalty, discipline, and hard work. I think these are things that are sort of really very much a given if you're a sort of ex-military candidate, and therefore I think at any interview and any sort of situation, it's probably not worth highlighting them because I think it just makes people look one-dimensional. The next one I want to cover is leadership. Leadership, obviously particularly important in the military, but the civilian world generally just doesn't get how we see leadership. And I think unless you're going for a CEO role, I'd be really sort of careful majoring on leadership, because actually what most companies are interested in is the other transferable skills, and in particular your sort of management skills. And I think that's really sort of key. So I'd be very careful about sort of majoring on command and all your sort of leadership skills throughout your military career. But all the rest I think are really key. So decision making, being accountable, adaptability is absolutely key, and that sort of analytical briefing skills also really important. And of course, being a team player. And I think the other thing that where we sometimes sell ourselves short is in sort of the diversity area. I think we have all worked in incredibly diverse areas with an incredibly mix of people from different stratas of society and across all sort of creeds and races as well. And I think that's something that perhaps we don't accept enough, and something that we don't recognise enough in ourselves, but it's an absolutely sort of key skill. In terms of those other top transferable skills, what I did is I searched across a load of organisations and a load of sort of technical papers on transferable skills, and this is what I sort of synthesised down. And these, I think, are the things that actually you perhaps want to major on, and these are the sort of things that you need to have some sort of information against in terms of your career. So if you've got a question, and for example, on interview on any of these, that you'd be able to give a good answer. But all of them are absolutely key, I think, in any sort of management role. And I think finally, the thing to do is counter stereotyping. Even really experienced employers that like ex-military, employ a lot of ex-military, still don't always understand sort of the nature of the sort of military beast. And I think it's really important at all steps along the process is to try and counter stereotyping and don't play into a stereotyping. And that's across everything, how you look, how you speak, how you come across, and also highlighting relevant skills as well. So what I've done here is sort of spectrum of military versus civilian roles. And clearly, I think as you move to the right, you need increasingly transferable skills. And my experience is that if you're sort of over on the left, which is where we pretty much all start, if you stay on the left, it's increasingly difficult to get right. And I think also my experience is the converse, that once you're over on the right, is actually very easy to move left. I went for a role, although I didn't see it through, as a bursar, and I think the fact that I'd been out of the military, gone into banking, was at the Bank of England and sort of picked up some additional transferable skills, that was really, really attractive to them. And I think they saw me as a quality candidate as opposed to perhaps a more traditional bursar that may have come out of the military, done something sort of vaguely sort of in the defence area, and then sort of moved into a bursar as their sort of a swan song, if you like. And I think the key is here, if as you move to the right, you really have to understand the skills that are relevant, emphasis that certain employers have on certain skills. You have to know the language and the lingo. And again, I think for a lot of us, although, you know, perhaps if you've got a niche skill, you could go straight to the right straight away. But actually, you may need to do some stepping stones. So it's understanding perhaps where you'd like to be in the future, and then the sort of roles that you could potentially go into to actually develop those transferable skills, and also give you a better opportunity in terms of your sort of credibility and sort of general competence in terms of the eye in the eye of that employer. Because I think all employers employing anyone who's ex-military, it's always a risk, and part of your job is to try and de-risk that and get across why you wouldn't be a high risk candidate, and that you're sort of an actual sort of shoe in for the job. So a lot of it is about being a chameleon. It's about sort of understanding when you may need to change and how you need to change, and where you do and don't need to adapt, and where you can sort of really benefit from additional things in terms of developing new skills or qualifications or whatever else. So I think for those younger members, you probably won't remember Mr. Ben, but he was a really popular series in the 70s, and it was a guy, Mr. Ben, who went to a fancy dress shop and put on a new outfit, and then went through a magic door and then lived that life. And I think this is very much the same for us in the military. It's about, you know, being able to change and adapt into something new and make it work. So what I've got here is really, I think, the sort of the key stages that I see in terms of transferable skills. And I think the first thing is you have to do is identify the skills. You've got to identify what you are, what skills you have, and also all the skills that sort of are out there, and try and then look at, you know, the range of skills you possess. And I think one thing that's quite useful here is to sift through job adverts and pick up on the types of skills that are required in a certain industry. And then I think the next thing is really to sort of cross-reference. And what you need to do here is really deconstruct your career. So that involves really looking at every job you've ever had, looking at everything you've done within those roles, and just breaking them down really sort of line by line till you've got sort of hundreds of lines of things that you've probably done, and then looking at how those skills then sort of permeate across those different roles. So it's all about sort of cross-referencing, which is really useful. And then it's really about looking at those skills and how they might match to particular jobs. And of course, it's not just about the particular role, but also fit to company as well. And I think that's particularly important, and increasingly so with modern employers. Most companies have sort of a defined set of values, very much like us in the military, and fit is incredibly important. So it's about understanding how you might be a best fit for any particular role. But I definitely recommend completely deconstructing your career, and that probably takes a lot of time. Actually, is literally just sit down and going through every position you've ever had, and then literally gathering everything up. And that will also help you when you need to then construct your CV somewhat downstream. And then I think the sort of fourth bit there is then once you've done all that, is about shaping, and that's about shaping the search for the role that you'd like or the organisation. It's about having a good CV. It's about understanding the language of some of these companies, and it also helps you obviously when you get to that sort of job hunting bit, and also all of your networking as well. Because I think the problem is that there's such a lot out there. It's how broad a front do you advance on, and versus sort of how narrow a front as well. And I think my advice would be to go on a broadish front, but actually have a sort of understanding of what looks like a potential opportunity, where you've got some real sort of transferable skills, and where perhaps you haven't, or you may need to look at sort of stepping stones as well. And then, of course, the final thing is you need to be able to sort of demonstrate all those transferable skills at interview as well. But to me, that's the 4 stages, and certainly that's something I've gone through. And I can't sort of emphasise enough that importance to really try and deconstruct your career, because I think many of us just assume we're one thing when perhaps we're not. A good friend of mine who's come out of the military recently, he had done a lot of training, and therefore his CV looked like a trainer. But of course, and therefore he was looking at some sort of training roles, but there was no real civilian fit there. And actually, if you deconstructed his career, he didn't actually do much training at all. A lot of what he did was project management. And therefore, I completely revamped to work with him to sort of deconstruct his career, look at his transferable skills, and then completely reshape his CV. So I think in terms of navigating the hurdles, you've got to understand that all organisations are different. And what I'll do is I'll start on the right with sort of the preparation. Phone interviews are actually really difficult, and you need to get them right, because quite often you're in with a junior recruiter, and all they've got is a sort of list of competencies. What they're looking for is a sort of tick box exercise to see if you progress to the next stage. Certainly when I was at the Bank of England, I'm no expert in terms of recruitment, but when we arrived, we lost about 35 people due to ARRC rule changes, and therefore I spent every single Friday recruiting for about a year. So I literally went through hundreds of CVs, and all put equally many interviews as well. So I've got a sort of relatively good understanding in terms of these different types of interviews, and we employed all of these techniques. So phone interview, really important to get right. One of my top tips for phone interviews would be to actually stand up and use your hands and gestures quite a bit, because that just, I think, gets your sort of personality across a lot more than just sort of sitting down with a pair of headphones. Panel interviews next. I think you really need to understand how they work, who's on the panel. Again, worth sometimes doing a bit of research in terms of those people that might be on the panel, and perhaps having a quick sort of look up on LinkedIn as well, which can also be useful. In terms of strategy exercises, increasingly used by a number of organisations. Certainly had quite a significant strategy exercise with Uber, and these things you really need to get right, particularly in a company like this where a lot of people are ex-consultants and they're expecting something that is really sort of well polished and really well structured. So if you haven't done one before, what I would do is practice and find some friends who can critique you, because if you get that wrong, you probably won't progress to the next stage. In terms of fit interviews, for my current role, I had about 7 interviews, and towards the end, we sometimes did this with a bank as well, is the people have got the skills, it's probably a strong candidate, but what you want to do is find out a bit more about what makes them tick and the fits they might be for the company. So this is a bit more sort of soft skills and a lot more about your own values, about how they fit with the culture of the organisation. The good news is if you've got to one of those, then you're probably doing well, so be confident and just make sure that you're sort of focusing yourselves in terms of the fit, as opposed to just looking at some of your hard skills as well. In terms of technical exercise analytics, quite widely employed now by a number of companies, particularly companies like Amazon, Uber as well. Quite often companies will sit you down and it might be a 2-hour analytics exercise, and that might be including manipulating data or doing pivot tables in spreadsheets, and being asked a sort of range of arithmetic type questions. My advice would be, if you get one of these, you need to do your research, because generally there isn't enough time to complete the exercise. It puts you under an incredible amount of time pressure, and therefore what I would do is, if you can get some sort of dummy papers, or you can just practice practice in terms of basic technical skills, data analysis, then really super useful. And again, if you don't do well at one of these, then you just won't progress past the initial stages, even if you're a fantastic candidate. And finally, psychometrics. Again, a number of companies use them. I went for a role at Ordnance Survey, and I had 3 psychometric exercises to do. And again, I wouldn't just leap in blind. I would thoroughly research them. In terms of tailoring your CV, I think it's important to understand different organisations and companies, like them formatted in a certain way. You might have to tweak the content. And I think the key thing here is it's not a list of your achievements. I mean, I was super proud of commanding a squadron in Iraq, and that's something that's really important to me, but it's probably not particularly important to an employer. And therefore, what's important to you and you think is really key for your CV might not come across well to employer. So it's about majoring on the skills that you think are most transferable and putting yourself in the best light as possible. In terms of the language, again, job adverts are really useful because they often couch things in terms of what they're looking for in the candidate, and therefore just play that back to them in terms of the language in your CV. And finally, I think I would just avoid this sort of endless qualifications after your name. I think employers find that off-putting or just completely ignore it. So what I would do is, clearly, if you're going for a logistics job and you've got a member of the Chartered Institute of Logistics, include that. But I think some people get sort of put off and find it sort of uncomfortable with people that have, that they're a fellow of about 20 institutes. So again, just be careful how you put yourself across. And in most organisations, rank is completely meaningless, because you wouldn't go to a job and say, in my last job, I was a grade 37. And before that, I was a grade 1, because all organisations grade differently, and therefore it's fairly pointless in terms of putting grades in. But of course, what it is used for is in terms of signposting your sort of relative seniority in terms of the roles. So you might have something in your CV that says junior manager, manager, senior manager, executive or something. So those sort of terms, I think, play better where there's a natural progression than concentrating on rank and things. And then I think in terms of the covering letter, what I would do is just spend quite a lot of time, and this could be, it took me a couple of weeks, is to write a really, really good generic letter and then tweak that as required. It'll save you an awful lot of time. And if it's optional, quite often it is, then I would definitely include a covering letter, but quite separate to the CV. And again, one should support the other. So I think the covering letter is very much about bringing your CV to life and covering some sort of really key aspects, the role requirements as well. So in terms of execute, what you need to do once you're on that sort of road to interview, really. Well, I think the first thing is to really understand what that job requires and actually the type of person they're after. Because sometimes roles aren't just after your skills, they might be after you, particularly as a person. So it's important to understand that. What I've done for a number of roles is actually distilled down the role in terms of like a job on the page. So I've put the summary of the values that you think are relevant to the role, some of the technical skills, some of the soft skills that are required, and also then looked ahead of what that role might entail moving forward in terms of how I might tackle that role. And what that produces, I think, is a really good synthesis in terms of matching that role in terms of your own skills and things that are important to you in terms of your own values. And also when you come to interview, it provides a really decent crib sheet as well, and helps you perhaps structure some of your answers, and will sort of help you structure your responses in terms of, if you've got the role, how might you tackle things, what would be important, what might be your priorities, etc. So I think that's certainly very useful. I think understanding as well that mix of hard and soft skills is really useful. And I think a good example would be people coming to interview for project management roles, and they might major on, they've got good experience of ITIL or Prince 2, or they've done, a number of courses, or they understand the processes and they understand stakeholder mapping and all that sort of thing. But I think what often people are after is how you can use some of those hard skills, but how they complemented with your soft skills. So, for example, anyone could draw a stakeholder map, but it's about how you then take forward that stakeholder map in terms of influence the right people, understanding the political landscape of a company. And I think that's the sort of difference between the sort of the grade A student and the sort of B and C student, is that really ability, I think, to take forward those sort of hard skills and sort of wrap them in a softer skills context. Obviously understand those skills that you possess and that are relevant, and really try and home in on those. And also, I think appropriate language. You can really tell the difference between somebody who genuinely knows about an organisation and somebody that's just bluffing by their understanding, I think, of the jargon, by the language used. And that's particularly sort of become apparent to me in the last sort of year or so, when you sort of move into quite a different environment where people are used to very much working in a different way. And then they use different terms, exactly like us in the military as well. And I think if you can get into that sort of mindset and you can understand that, then it will certainly help you along. In terms of getting your competencies across, then to my mind, it's really about having clear examples that bring out your transferable skills and experiences against the competencies of the role and the role requirements. And the way you've probably seen this is situation, task, action, result, which is, I think, not a bad way to go, particularly for competency-based interviews. I also include another R as well in terms of relevance, and it's about getting across, you've done something, you've got a result, and I think it's particularly relevant or pertinent to this role because I can see how that translates across, and I think I can add value in that area. So I think that's the next thing to do on top of the sort of the basic start. And then people start joining the dots and start thinking, oh right, okay, I can see how this person's actually going to deliver against this role, rather than just being a sort of a good person with the right skills. And certainly I think as you get more senior, perhaps there's a move away from competency-based interviews in terms of specific challenges they might have, or specific experience you may have, and how that might be relevant to a particular organisation, and how you might actually physically deliver things moving forward. And therefore, I think certainly for senior roles, you have to have a pretty good and clear understanding in terms of how your skills transfer into the ability to deliver something that that organisation wants in the future, and how you can add value there as well. And I think finally, you really need to understand why you want the job. A lot of companies now, they quite often major on this. It's not good enough just to say, I really want to go and work for company X because it looks like a really good organisation, and I'm interested in what it does. I think you really got to try and develop a better connection with that, and come up with a story as to why you think that this job is your role, why you really want it, because I think that sort of quite often sets apart two candidates that might be very close. And I would definitely recommend having a final spiel in any interview in terms of why you want the job and why you're particularly suitable, because I think that just reinforces again that you're probably hopefully the right candidate. And I think one of the things in terms of transferring into new organizations is to understand that as you go on this journey, everything you do, new opportunities may open. So do not burn any bridges. Stay positive. Yeah, you will have dark days. I've had some pretty grim days and worried about never being able to get a job and all this sort of thing, but you just have to sort of hang in there, be super positive, super polite, super bright all the time, and just sort of go at it with all your sort of energy. Treat everyone like you meet like a job lead. I think there is a degree of serendipity and sort of karma in this. If you're polite and open to people, and then I think it opens doors. And I think the other thing is build your network. You don't have to go out there aggressively networking, but certainly understand who might be able to help you, and how you can sort of build that network in the right direction. And it can take a bit of time, but I think you just have to sort of chip away, use friends and family as well. And then I think finally, in terms of that, is be aware that quite often people go for an interview, they don't get the role, but then the company says, oh, but we think you'll be a good fit for this other role we've got, or in a different department. And after all, it's all super good experience as well, getting interviewed. So I think the more you can get your foot in the door, the better. I had an experience where an military person came to interview with me. They probably wouldn't have quite cut the grade in terms of just their CV. I helped them get to interview. I thought they were actually a reasonable candidate, but the other people interviewing thought they were quite poor. Interestingly, on the back of that, the person didn't actually drop me a line at all to say thank you, or thank you for the opportunity, and is there anything perhaps I could have done that I didn't. They didn't even ask for any feedback. And then about 7 or 8 months later, this person dropped me an email saying, oh, have you got any more jobs going? And I just referred him to the website. So I think you have to, don't burn your bridges, and make sure that at each stage in the process you're opening up, you're building those transferable skills, and you're opening up doors and opening up those opportunities for the future. Right, and finally I thought, well, I put my money where my mouth is and see if I can find a job and go through some of the things that we probably have learned throughout the rest of the webinar. So what I thought is I picked somewhere completely random where somebody might be living, so I went for Luton. And then I assumed I was perhaps a senior captain or a major, sort of broad management skills, and pay of about 50k. And I just sort of set myself a task the other evening to see if I could find a job and how I might go about it, using the sort of process we've learned in terms of identifying the skills, cross-referencing, then matching, and then shaping. So what I did is actually found that there's quite a number of employers within the Luton area, and you can see them there on the right. So you've got VW. I had no idea, but then I remembered there was a colonel, I think, at Army headquarters who went to work for VW. So of course, the next thing I would do is probably try and find him on LinkedIn, perhaps reach out to him, sort of understand a bit more about VW, perhaps to see who the hiring manager is, etc., and look at the various opportunities within VW. Of course, EasyJet is in Luton, really big employer, and of course there's a whole raft of people from the military that have gone into aviation. I think Stansted had quite a large ex-military community, and of course Heathrow employs a vast range of ex-military as well. So again, it's about sort of, then I went to the EasyJet website and I researched the sorts of roles, and actually there's a whole raft of roles at EasyJet that don't involve actually being in the air. So I thought there's some real opportunities there. And then Whitbread is a reasonable employer around there. And then again, I researched the company. I found out that they don't just make beer, that they're one of the biggest hotel owners in the UK. And then so I sort of went down that road as well and looked into Whitbread, looked at the sort of skills they require, looked at how mine might transfer. And I thought, oh, actually, there was probably a couple of roles there that I could probably apply for. And then finally, Leonardo, of course, defence contractor. Previously Finmeccanica, Italian sort of company originally, and then I researched them. I found that they got a site in Southampton, a site in Yeovil, a number of sites around the country, and then there was some research again across their website, and looked at who I knew that works in that sort of area, and friends that have worked previously in sort of the air or aeronautical industries, and again looking at how I might get it in, how I might network, and again looking at some skills. So having done all that, I sort of came up with this job as a project assurance manager in terms of supply chain, and you can see there on that slide, so it's the next slide, Lisa, in terms of sort of key areas in terms of that role. And I thought, wow, I could probably apply for that, probably get that. So again, all I've done is just sort of applied what I've covered in this webinar, and for a sort of evening's work, probably came up with some really good companies there that probably again have a whole raft of jobs within them that you probably didn't even know exist, but actually not that difficult to get an in, and I would imagine not that difficult to get a potential interview as well. That doesn't mean it's easy, What I'm just saying is that the opportunities are out there. Just needs to take some time and effort in terms of legwork, and then obviously again all the good advice that the Officers Association provides as well. It is worth taking. So yeah, so that there I reckon is a job that probably some of the people on this webinar could probably go for, and again some of those companies as well. So give it a go, just get out there, just work hard, and hopefully something will turn up. And I say the main thing is to stay positive.
Brilliant, thanks so much, James. I think especially this last exercise has been really interesting, and as you say, people perhaps seeing things that they might not have thought about, but starting with how much they need to earn, what kind of geographic area, and organisations that they've heard of, and definitely emphasising the importance of networking and trying to identify somebody that you might know, even if it's a friend of a friend that works in that company, to get you an in. Brilliant, thank you. We're just going to move on now to some questions. So we've had a few questions being sent through as the webinar has progressed. One question has been around soft skills, and someone has asked how much are soft skills such as emotional intelligence or listening becoming more important in a business environment? Would you say that they are?
Yeah, I think in many ways they are becoming more important. And I think things, as I said earlier, things like creativity, the ability to listen, because a lot of companies now in terms of their sort of HR policies, very much about listening, it's about 360 feedback. And it's quite a different environment from the military. And I think for what you need to do is understand those sort of soft skills that are relevant. And what I've often done in the past is to, in answer to sort of interview questions or whatever, is try and start with a hard skill that perhaps demonstrates that you understand the process, you have the knowledge to understand how something might be structured, or from a sort of policy point of view, or you might have the right skill set from a technical point of view, and then move into how you might actually use that on the ground in terms of your soft skills. And I think that often provides some quite good sort of interview answers. So for example, I think the sort of stakeholder management thing is perhaps a one that people will just say, or people say, I'll just write a comms plan or write a stakeholder management plan or whatever. And you think, oh, that's great, that's one score. But if you can talk about, I think, softer skills and just things like, writing thank you letters, for example. I remember being interviewed and said, I understand about stakeholder management, blah, 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 blah. But I said, actually, what often makes a real difference in stakeholder management is just those sort of small things. It's about building rapport. It's about being polite. It's about being on time, because it shows respect for other people. And when you've come away from, say, a particular meeting or whatever, then drop them a quick note of thanks. And I think some of those good manners, and if you sort of come across with some of those things in interview, people are like, oh, wow, this person doesn't just understand the sort of technical side of things, they really understand how to sort of bring it alive. And also I think it gives you a bit more sort of gravitas, and it seems a bit more maturity, if you like, and a bit more seniority, rather than just looking at the sort of cold sort of hard skills.
Brilliant, thank you, James. Another question we've had is around, you referred to preparing for technical or strategy exercises. Do you have any particular resources that you would recommend in terms of perhaps websites or even books or whatever? That would be great.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I bought there's a number of books that consultancies provide. There's like the McKinsey way and that sort of thing, which are quite generic. Some of the things there are quite useful. Certainly, I think the ability to produce a really polished deck is quite important if you're given a strategy exercise, and that's quite different from the sort of stuff that we're perhaps used to producing in the military. Although strangely, a sort of a sync matrix and a slide, a sort of ConOps slide for the military actually sometimes translates quite well, but it's got to look good. I think if you've ever worked with consultants, which some of you may have, then what I would do is see if you can get hold of some of the way they've gone about things. If people have perhaps RFPs, so requests for proposals, and they've had a proposal in from a company, look at how companies shape a RFP. That can be quite useful. And I think sometimes just a bit of a trawl around the internet to see how things are structured. And the other key thing about the strategy is that if you get one of these strategy interviews, then you probably will need to take quite a bit of time in actually developing that strategy. And certainly when I did it, I reached out to a friend who works for a sort of cultural change consultancy, and she provided some critique and feedback. I think there's a rule of three, three things on look good, and she sort of structured it in terms of a sort of a goals and a pillars perspective. And then a couple of other people I know, I presented the deck to them, and they sort of said, oh, well, this looks a bit clunky and this looks a bit amateur. And I think the thing to do is try and get some really critical feedback. The problem is you generally go to one of your friends, show them something, they say, oh yeah, that's pretty good, I'm sure you'll be fine. But what you want is somebody to be a bit more ruthless, and that goes for CVs as well. You really want someone to be ultra ruthless, and that goes to whether it's interview preparation or strategy preparation or CV preparation. You need people to dig deep, because that's the only way that you're going to get something that probably will stand up to some, certainly if you're going for sort of more significant role.
Great, thanks, James. I'm just going to move a slide onto a slide that James prepared for us. So rather than just having that blank slide with the word questions on it, I'll leave that for you so that you can kind of take some of that away with you. But moving on to another question, a question about covering letters. How long should a covering letter be in your experience? Is short and punchy better, or is it an opportunity to give more detail?
Yeah, so I think generally you don't want to go into pages, because I think that will put people off. But I think something like probably about a page and a half. Certainly what I've done is once I've got my generic covering letter, you'd probably have that on the left. I would then got the job role on the right, tease out the key parts of the job role, and then match across from my covering letter to the key parts of the role, because that's what they're looking for, is can they deliver? And then I think it's really about sort of bringing that sort of CV to life. And then I think don't try and be overly witty or humorous and that sort of thing, but there's nothing wrong with adding in the sort of odd thing. I mean, when I went for a job, I think in Southampton, I said, I'm a big Southampton supporter as well, so it'd be great to work in Southampton. So I mean, something like that is fine, but don't try and be too clever. And I would say generally don't try and be too clever. It's like you see some people's CVs now, they're like super pumped up and they've got tons of colours. And I think if you've been out of the military for some years and you've worked in a range of sort of really ultra dynamic roles, and you restructured 10 companies, then go for a clever CV. I think for most of us, keep it fairly simple. Otherwise, it just looks like perhaps you're trying a bit too hard. But yeah, so I think that's my advice for covering letter: a page and a half, depending on exactly the role. But don't go into endless detail. It's really just to think, oh, they're quite a good candidate. I think I might read their CV in a bit more detail. Whereas occasionally I've read covering letters and thought, you know what, I can't be bothered, or I just skim their CV. I've read CVs and probably spent 10 seconds on a CV and rejected it. But it's because hiring managers don't always have the time to read hundreds of CVs in detail in the margins of a day job.
Absolutely. Thanks, James. We've had a couple of questions that are quite kind of personal in a way. So, and about your own experience. People are wanting to know how you're finding the experience of working in what might be termed a non-traditional organisation such as Uber, especially after the Bank of England. And also, you talked about the importance of telling the story of why you wanted the job. Would you be willing to share elements of your story as to why you wanted to work at Uber?
Oh, right, okay, yeah. I can't remember exactly what I said, but clearly one of the things I did say is that my first job in the army was as a young transport platoon commander, and therefore transport has always been an interest for me. It's in my blood. It's not something I've just turned to recently. It's something I have a genuine interest. And the other thing I sort of also spoke about is things like, for years and years, governments and industries and cities have gone about reducing congestion, reducing emissions. And I think what appealed to me about Uber is it's one of the few companies that actually put its money where its mouth was and actually tried to make a real difference. And I think it genuinely has made a genuine difference, and it is genuinely committed as well to those aspirations of reducing car ownership, cleaner air, fewer emissions, and really sort of cities that are better serving the people that live there. And therefore, I think if you can develop a reason that perhaps brings out some passions that you have, some personal passions, if it aligns with your own personal values, and that you've also got a history, for example, going back to your roots of having an interest of something, not just in terms of sort of hard skills or whatever, but a genuine interest that when you pick up the paper, you're interested in, say, transport stories, or you're interested in stories about global warming or whatever. Now, I think if you can do that, then people really make the connection and think, right, this isn't just somebody that's putting this on because they're desperate to get a job or whatever, or they're desperate to come to a tech company, that there's a genuine reason there and there's a genuine passion. So I think they're the things you really sort of have to tap into. Certainly, I think when I went for the bank, I had a real interest. The initial job I went for was actually the project manager the new £10 note with Jane Austen on it. And I've done quite a lot of research on that. And again, I think it's about trying to get a connection with the interviewer and an understanding, I think, why you might sort of be a better candidate than somebody else. And I think one of the things that's worth doing, I think definitely in terms of asking questions, ask people what they like about working at an organisation. That's a really good interview question because it puts a question back on them. It gives you a bit of a breather. And when they tell you what they like about the organisation, you can sometimes then weave that back in and play it back to them. So obviously, if somebody says, "I love working here because I love the people, I love the spreadsheets," you can say, "Yeah, one of the things I really love is spreadsheets." I mean, I don't think you have to be quite as blatant as that, but it's about building that rapport with the interviewer and conveying a connection and a passion about why you might want to roll. Is that all right?
Brilliant. Thanks, James. I think you're absolutely right. I think passion is really important to convey, and I think if you can do that, people will sit up and listen. One interesting question we've had is asking you: is there anything you feel you might have done wrong in your transition, or anything you've learned not to do?
A couple of things I've learned. I got some really good advice. I think sometimes in the military we think we're sometimes quite bold and quite feisty. I think once we're out of that environment, we're quite perhaps a bit too timid. And I think perhaps I was a bit too timid early on. Somebody gave me a really good piece of advice, was to just push one more time than you think that you should. So for example, if somebody doesn't quite follow up with you, just reach out to them one more time to try and make that connection, or just push one bit harder. It doesn't mean you need to keep pushing and pushing, because eventually that will become irritating. But don't be shy. I think some of the other things is that I wish I'd probably done a bit more networking early on, and I think that would have been useful. And I think a bit more early research as well is that I think that would have been useful. So I think even if you're looking to, say, leave in a year's time, I would start all this sort of process now in terms of finding what's out there and having a better understanding of how civilian life works. I mean, I went to Sandhurst at the age of 18, so I must say I was pretty naive, and I thought I knew a bit about it, but clearly I didn't. And I think just understanding what's out there is I was pretty clueless, to be honest, when I first left, and I really didn't know what I wanted to do. I think the other thing is as well is just having that understanding in terms of if you want to do a role that's far removed from the military, you have to sort of start on that journey. otherwise it does become increasingly difficult. So that, yeah. In terms of doing anything wrong, I don't know. I don't think I had any sort of great failures. I think you just have to sort of keep plugging away, and don't be afraid to try some quite diverse things as well. You know, you don't have to contain yourself to a particular path. When I went for the job here, at the same time I went for a job at Ordnance Survey as a chief of staff there. So again, something completely different, but something that I'd quite interested.
Great, thank you, James. I'm just going to ask one final question because we're kind of running out of time, unfortunately, which is about how people should kind of work out what level to pitch themselves at, and also whether you recommended, is it wise often to perhaps what people might perceive as dropping a level or two in order to get where you want?
Good question. I think for some people, depending on circumstances, certainly dropping a level may be wise. I think certainly if you're going for, I mean, if you came to work here, for example, because the opportunities and the promotion is pretty quick if you're good. So I think it depends on the certain circumstances. And again, some of these internships, you may feel that you're dropping a level to start off with. But that's not necessarily a bad thing because it's a bit of a softer landing. There's less expectation on you. I think the worst thing is probably to go to a role where you're completely and utterly out of your depth, and actually at that point you're probably unlikely to progress. So I think it's certainly worth looking at, but I would say at the same time, don't sell yourself short. I think sometimes you know, you have some dark days and oh my God, it's all going wrong. Perhaps, you know, you lose a bit of confidence in yourself. You think, oh, perhaps I'm pitching too high. Perhaps I'm not as good as I thought I was, and all this sort of thing. And I think the thing to do is just to say, stay positive and just, you know, get out there and find those sort of roles that you can get, because they're definitely out there. So don't sell yourself short either. In terms of pitching yourself, I think in the military there's that sort of rank thing versus role, and I would ignore a lot of that. I mean, there's, you know, some fantastic senior ranks that, you know, I know that are much more, you know, competent and, you know, perhaps has had, you know, greater transferable skills than some officers I know. So don't necessarily equate rank with the level that you might go in at, but of course, certain roles it may be relevant.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, James. I think, you know, I mean, I certainly personally particularly liked your kind of version of the STAR model, adding relevance on the end there. I think that's really great, and I really like that, you know, making it relevant to the person that you're talking to and how, so that they can imagine how you're going to fit and most importantly deliver.
Yeah.
Also, I really strong message on the importance of networking, and I think, you know, in answer to that question we've just had about what level to pitch at, you know, just talk to people and ask them, and, you know, talk, you know, all networking is talking, so just keep talking to people.
Exactly.
But thanks so much for your time this evening. And I think it's been a really great webinar. We've had loads of really good feedback. You know, lots of people, rather than asking questions, have just been saying thank you very much, really useful. Thank you so much, James. Brilliant webinar, etc. So real testament to the quality of the information that you've been sharing with us this evening. Thank you, James.
It's an absolute pleasure, and all the very best with all of your futures and all that sort of job hunting. And remember, time spent at recce.
Absolutely, and it's not a cliche, it's absolutely true. Brilliant. Well, thanks to you all for listening this evening. I hope you all got a lot out of tonight's webinar. If you've got any further questions, please do send them over to us at our client admin address, which you can find on our website. But for future webinars, look on the events page under employment on our website, and we hope to hear you tuning in again. But thank you, James, and good evening to everyone.